Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the United States, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's ARIA Formula meeting on the humanitarian crisis in Cameroon. We are joined by a distinguished panel of speakers, and I will introduce them individually in a moment, who will inform us about the scope of the crisis and make recommendations on how to address it. I would like to thank our co-hosts, the Dominican Republic, Germany, and the United Kingdom for their support in organizing today's gathering, and we would like to warmly welcome participating member states and members of civil society who are joining us in this room and via webcast all over the world. Today's meeting is an opportunity to better understand Cameroon's humanitarian crisis, the challenges and the dangers of helping populations in need, and the threats to respect for international humanitarian law. Our desired outcomes for this meeting are an increased awareness and visibility of the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Cameroon, plus the immediate opening of humanitarian space and the provision of unhindered access for humanitarian personnel by parties to the conflict. Since 2018, the United States government has contributed more than $87 million in Cameroon to provide humanitarian assistance to host communities, IDPs, and refugees. This aid is critical for saving lives, but it can only be effective when we have access to vulnerable populations. To better understand the scale of the crisis, I am delighted to be joined by leaders in the field with firsthand knowledge of the situation on the ground. Undersecretary General Mark Lowcock needs no introduction regarding his role in overseeing UN humanitarian assistance. We are grateful that you are here. We also welcome two expert practitioners who made the trip to New York to speak to us regarding their personal experiences providing humanitarian assistance in Cameroon. Esther Omam Njomo is the Executive Director of Reach Out Cameroon. Welcome, Esther, to the UN, and thank you for taking the trip from the southwest region of Cameroon. Father Paul Fru Njoki Kong serves as the Director of Caritas for the Archdiocese of Bamenda in the northwest region of Cameroon. Thank you for joining us in New York. Finally, noted humanitarian Jan Egeland, the current Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council and former UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, joins us by video conference from Oslo. John, we look forward to hearing more about what you saw and heard during your recent trip to Cameroon. But first things first, Undersecretary Lowcock, I invite you to set the stage for our conversation. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to join this afternoon's discussion on this important but underreported crisis. Cameroon, which is one of the largest economies in Africa, is currently facing worsening violence and conflict. Today, 4.3 million people need humanitarian assistance across the country. That is 30% more than last year, and it means that one Cameroonian in 6 needs humanitarian assistance or protection. And most of those people needing help, more than half of them are children. 8 regions out of the country's 10 regions are affected by one of 3 concurrent, simultaneous humanitarian crises in Cameroon at the moment. Firstly, in its east and north regions, Cameroon is hosting more than 270,000 refugees from the Central African Republic, putting a significant burden on host communities who are already very poor and live in very fragile and vulnerable conditions. Second, Cameroon's far north remains affected by the Lake Chad Basin crisis. That, as you know, is one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. 1.9 million people or so living in Cameroon's far north, that's half the population of that part of the country, need urgent assistance, and that includes 100,000 refugees or more from Nigeria. I do, on this note, want particularly to thank and recognise the government of Cameroon and the people of Cameroon, especially in that part of the country, for their generosity in hosting refugees from neighbouring countries. Thirdly, the humanitarian situation in the northwest and southwest regions has rapidly deteriorated, and that is what I want to talk most about in my presentation to you today. The crisis in the northwest and southwest regions started with peaceful protests in the English-speaking regions, but has now turned violent. It was one of the fastest growing displacement crises in Africa last year. For the past 3 years, the population has been subjected to ongoing violence and attacks by armed actors. The level of the crisis today is more alarming than ever. Both the humanitarian and the security situation continue to deteriorate and run the risk of spiralling out of control, including in neighbouring departments, namely the littoral and west. In 2018, last year, 160,000 people were estimated to need humanitarian assistance in the northwest and southwest regions. Today, there are not 160,000, but more than 1.3 million people, at least 8 times as many, in need, and that amounts to a third of the local population. 500,000 people are internally displaced. Some of those internally displaced people stay with host communities in the main towns in the western part of the country, or in Yaoundé, or in the country's largest city, Douala. Most of them, though, are still hiding in the forests in fear of violence. Thousands of homes and entire villages have been destroyed across the 2 regions, and that poses significant challenges to the goal of return for people who've fled. The fear of attacks further prevents people from being able to return, and also prevents access to previous livelihoods, especially farming and other livelihood opportunities in their home areas. That means those people are essentially increasingly, and in some cases totally, reliant on humanitarian assistance. Ordinary people are the direct targets of violence. Children are caught in crossfire. They're subject to arbitrary arrest and detention. The northwest and southwest regions used previously to be the places where education was best across the country, but a ban on education imported by armed actors has undermined that. In the past 3 years, at least 70 schools have been destroyed, pupils have been kidnapped, teachers have been kidnapped. Today, more than 80% of schools are closed, and more than 600,000 children are deprived of an education in both regions. Attacks on medical staff and infrastructure have also increased. There have been at least 70 such incidents noted since last year. They include the abductions of medical staff. They also include the burning of at least 3 hospitals. In both regions, some 40% of health facilities are simply not operational. Sexual violence and abuse are also increasingly documented. There are reports of girls as young as 13 living in the forest, pregnant and scared to move. In response to this grim reality, and despite the challenges, UN agencies and NGOs have scaled up the delivery of humanitarian assistance and protection. There are more than 40 humanitarian organisations operational today. They're mostly local NGOs. They've between them reached more than 100,000 people so far this year. 42,000 of the most vulnerable people received emergency livelihood programme or dry food delivery in March, but only 30,000 were reached with that kind of assistance in April. And that is a reflection of the access challenges and the impact of the continuing violence. While the environment is complex, there's no question that we need a more ambitious and comprehensive response. We're trying to target 820,000 people for assistance in the region this year. Insecurity, violence, what are called weekly ghost town days, where businesses and shops are closed and civilians are forced to stay at home, and frequent lockdowns, all of those things limit the days on which humanitarian operations are possible. We do have access. It's limited and unpredictable, and we continue to work with all actors to continue to improve it. We're also increasing our engagement with communities to build acceptance and negotiate access with all the parties. And on this point, we work through existing structures, including faith-based groups and national NGOs, who are often best placed to support access for the humanitarian agencies. Humanitarians themselves are at risk. At least a dozen national staff of humanitarian organisations have been abducted since last year. Thankfully, so far, they've all been released. National NGOs are especially vulnerable to these risks, and we need more experienced humanitarian staff in order us to navigate these difficulties and complexities more effectively. The biggest challenge, notwithstanding everything I've said so far, relates to the insufficiency of funding. In 2018, the UN's Cameroon Humanitarian Response Plan was actually one of the smallest in terms of the resources we were seeking to respond to needs. Despite that, despite being a small plan, it was also one of the least well-funded globally. This year, the United Nations and NGOs are looking for some $300 million to reach 2.3 million people, including a third of them in the northwest and southwest regions. And of that $300 million, we've so far received only 38 million, less than 13% of what we require. Half of that money was received for the northwest and southwest crises, and most of that $19 million was in fact allocated by me through the Central Emergency Response Fund. I do want to thank all of the donors who provided funds to the SURF last year. As you know, we had a record-breaking year of financing for the SURF, and it was only because of that we were able to make this allocation for those parts of Cameroon. There are 4 critical sectors: education, health, water and sanitation and hygiene, and nutrition, for which we've received barely any funding this year. Such is the overall situation on lack of funding. As you'll all understand, humanitarian organisations can't sustain a response unless they're funded. They're essentially out of their own forms of resources. Indeed, several key frontline humanitarian agencies, especially international NGOs, are going to be forced to withdraw from the region if additional funding doesn't reach them soon. It's in no one's interest, I think, to see the humanitarian situation spiral out of control. So I ask today for the help of the international community in 3 areas. First and foremost, to increase awareness of the humanitarian problem in Cameroon, and this afternoon's meeting is an important way of doing that, but we need to build on it. We have to persuade everybody to come together to address the underlying causes of the current crisis, including and especially the need for peaceful resolution of conflict and the need for more progress with sustainable development. Secondly, I ask for your support and that of others to improve the financing we have for the humanitarian operation so that we can reach a larger proportion of those people in need. And thirdly, I ask for your help and assistance in persuading and causing all parties to respect international law and to provide safe, timely and unimpeded humanitarian access. Anybody with influence over the parties should please exercise that influence. And we'll also need to urgently strengthen awareness and respect for humanitarian principles, including the protection of education and medical facilities. I've described to you the attacks on those facilities, which, as you know, those attacks are violations, and we need better compliance with the key elements of international law. This situation is quite urgent, and I therefore rely on your support to enable us to tackle it better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary General Lowcock, for those sobering facts and calls for action and what we can do to help. Esther, your organization has been responding to the needs identified at the community levels. We welcome your statement about what you are seeing on the ground. Esther.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the Security Council for inviting me today to this important meeting on Cameroon. I am Jomo Esther Omam, the Executive Director of Reach Out, a locally based organization, civil society organization, whose headquarters is in the southwest region of Cameroon. Equally, I am the General Coordinator for the Southwest and Northwest Women's Task Force. It pleases me to sit before you this day, not only as the Executive Director of Reach Out, nor the General Coordinator of the Southwest and Northwest Women's Task Force, but as a woman, a mother, a wife, a daughter, and a sister who would like to give a human face to the ongoing crisis in the two regions today. I am here to talk on behalf of those women, mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters who have lost it all to this crisis. Those who are trapped in the bushes, in the forest, because they lost everything which they could hold on to. I am here today thinking about those women who are living in uncompleted buildings in other regions, other than where they were living. I am here today talking on behalf of those women who are today called refugees or internally displaced, who live in host communities, those who live in motor parks, those who live in petrol stations, those whose children are not going to school, those girls and women who are sexually abused, and the boys who have adopted negative coping attitudes. I am equally here today to talk on behalf of the Southwest and Northwest Women's Task Force, whose aim is to significantly contribute in ending this crisis. I am here for those women who for the past 1 year have been carrying this symbol of orange, which stands for non-violence, meaning that women, mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters, we are for non-violence. I'll be talking about the humanitarian issues in the ongoing conflict and make a call to action. I will say that I'm giving a human face to the crisis in the Northwest and Southwest regions, which has greatly affected both regions for the past 3 years. Our communities, swept up in conflict, have left hundreds of deaths, suffering masses, and over 1 million in need of life-saving assistance. The situation is becoming increasingly desperate, with no one spared from the violence and trauma, which is spiraling out of control. The violence has uprooted over 500,000 people from their homes and forced over 40,000 people to seek refuge in neighboring Nigeria. Displacement, which is already very high, continues to have serious consequences on the livelihoods and living conditions of the affected populations. Many of the conflict-affected people, especially women, are growing more vulnerable as the violence persists. A violence which has been present in both regions for the past 3 years, and humanitarian assistance remains inadequate and still far from covering all humanitarian needs. The vulnerability has been further compounded by the lack of access to farmlands and markets, the deterioration in medical and water facilities, the lack of shelter and civil status documents. Many health care services as well as health structures and medical staff have come under attack. In most areas within the conflict zones, health facilities are non-functional or have been burnt with medical staff who have fled fearing for their lives. Education has also been significantly impacted with very limited access. Presently, less than 15 to 20% of children go to school. The majority of the displaced are women and children who, ironically, are the base of the society who need protection at all times. It is estimated that over 3,000 children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition and require urgent treatment. Regrettably, more than 40% of clinics and health centers no longer provide vaccination, antenatal clinics, antiretroviral treatments, and less than 15% of births are assisted by skilled attendants. In this regard, we wish to say that the violent situation prevailing in the Northwest and Southwest regions is now an incubator of human rights violation and abuses, a source of pain and misery. We have a woman who just died 3 days ago before I could embark on my journey to this place, a pregnant woman who got into labor, and the labor got complicated. And the population, the neighbors, were afraid to take her to the nearby health center because that is a day nobody was supposed to go out. The neighbors called for civil society organizations who are involved into humanitarian assistance. They tried all their best to secure access to no avail. They looked for motorbikes to transport the lady, and these refused for fear of being shot. Till late in the night, and in the early hours of the next day, this woman died with the baby in her womb. Our children suffer or die every day, and we cannot sit and be indifferent amidst such chaos without talking, and more importantly, without acting. Why will you ask me, a mother, a woman, a wife, a daughter, a sister, not to talk about what I see every day going on in our communities? Why won't I talk about what is happening to our children, to ourselves? Most of our children, in order to cope in these deteriorating conditions, have tried to survive and are now using negative coping mechanisms such as stealing, juvenile delinquency, prostitution, or becoming drug addicts. STIs, HIV and AIDS are on the rise among the youth population as a result of rape and early forced marriages. The rate of teenage pregnancies, early motherhood, and trafficking in persons have increased due to the hardship people experience. It is paramount on all stakeholders to establish respect, dignity, and prosperity for our children and the next generations. Access to these displaced persons for any sort of humanitarian intervention can vary depending on whom the specific actors are. If today you are not known in the community becomes suspicious, and it is difficult for you to get into that community to provide whatsoever support or aid you have for them. Women, especially civil society leaders, for example, have ways of making inroads into these conflict-ridden communities. This is because the women are mothers, wives, sisters, and givers of life, and they do care about children's welfare. For this reason, we are calling on all international organizations, the UN, and others who are concerned with humanitarian response to work closely with national organizations that have access and acceptance from the communities. This is because there is a mutual understanding and trust among the communities and the national organizations. When it comes to reach out, for example, we had previously covered all the 6 divisions of the Southwest region for other programs before this crisis. And SNOT, which stands for Southwest and Northwest Women's Task Force, has a representation in all 13 divisions that make up the Northwest and Southwest region. This access is possible because most of our women-led organizations are spread within 13 divisions. Inasmuch as this is done, national organizations and civil society need technical support, guidance and capacity building from the international humanitarian community to make sure that the response is more effective, timely, and acceptable, and of acceptable quality, following humanitarian principles. Investment in local capacity will also help to ensure sustainability of the response and greater accountability toward affected communities. While international humanitarian presence was strengthened last year, and despite our combined efforts, we believe that only a few, less than 10%, reach out source of the affected population has received assistance so far because the resources are limited and access to some areas remain problematic. Given the fact that many dialogue alternatives with no concrete follow-up have been initiated locally and each party still maintains their position, there is an urgent need for both parties to come together and start talking. If not, the possibility of an immediate end of hostility will still be elusive. This will imply continued violence and hostility within the communities, and thereby continued massive population displacement and humanitarian needs. Thus, we suggest the following. First, 3 years after the beginning of the crisis, the UN and its partners should urgently step up humanitarian aid because what is given is far below expectation than what is required. Meanwhile, we do not know why very little attention is paid to this crisis in the Northwest and Southwest when it comes to humanitarian aid. We therefore call on all humanitarian actors to step up the engagement in humanitarian efforts. Secondly, reach out and SNOT think that there should be more effective presence and regular field visits, not just in Buea and Bamenda, the capital cities of the 2 regions, but in the deep field where the needs are direst. By so doing, they will have more accurate data from the victims or those affected from within the communities about their conditions and needs. This will enable a more tailored assistance and greater accountability to the affected population. Thirdly, we encourage stronger partnership between international humanitarian partners and national organizations to expand humanitarian access and go a step further in the localization of humanitarian assistance. Fourthly, the UN and other international actors can encourage and offer different services to protect and address humanitarian needs. They can offer, for example, home shelter programs by putting in place temporary homes for the victims and affected populations. They can also institute legal counseling and referral systems and have a field presence to step up confidence among the population. finally, and beyond humanitarian programming. The UN could support greater efforts to encourage talks and dialogue between the conflicting parties, who are brothers, for an eventual end to the crisis, for them to come up with a roadmap to achieving sustainable peace that builds more on our existing strength and influence. I earlier said that I had been a victim 3 times. 2 times, I was attacked in my home at gunpoint. The first time, I was thrown on the floor, and a knock hit my head, which caused me getting low cuts since then because I developed health issues. Still, I kept my morale high because I had many who were looking on to me for provision of care and support. The second time, in my own very house, all of my family was held hostage for 3 hours, for I don't know why. And my grandson, the first grandson, was being taken away from me when I was giving him medication because he was very sick after his first anniversary. And he was being tossed up and down like a ball and threatened to be taken away from me when the mother was not even in the region. And I asked the people in front of me, my son, what did I do wrong that I should get this from you? I died that day. I died that day as a mother, as a grandmother. But I resurrected with the determination to forge ahead in my activism to see that I carry on the crusade for peace, because I could put myself in the shoes of all those women and girls who have gone through the pains and suffering which I just witnessed in a very short period of time. The third time, my 2 children on the 20th of April were kidnapped. And again, I kept cool the first day, the second day. I put on the face of a CEO and a general coordinator. In the night of the second day, I could not bear it anymore. The mother in me resurrected, and I passed out. Thanks to an adopted doctor of mine, I was brought back to life. And I'm here today to speak on behalf of all those women who have gone through these ordeals, through the pains and sufferings. And I'm here today to talk about that little girl who is called Mariana, whose mother and siblings were shot. And the father had to flee, had to run into the bushes, into the forest. And she was left alone in the care of her paternal aunt. And because the paternal aunt had a son who is dropped out from school because schools are not going on, and this child was not also going to school, a 12-year-old girl, she was sexually abused by this boy and got pregnant. And when the aunts discovered this, she was thrown away from that house, sent to the unknown. And our members got this information and brought the report to us. And we as mothers, as women, were heartbroken and we started looking for this girl. What about Mama Joanna, who told us in one of our distribution sites where we are distributing food in collaboration, in partnership with WFP, who told us that she had to trek for 2 to 3 hours in order to get to us for food, that she passed so many corpses as she was coming in the forest path, and other women saw and got frightened and went back. What about Mr. John, who left one of the villages and had to trek 20 kilometers in order to get to one of the distribution sites? what about all these people who are going through pain and suffering? We think that it is time for us to start silencing the guns. We think that it is time for us to start talking. Let us begin to talk. Let us start talking genuinely. Let us start having inclusive dialogue. Let us sit face to face, facing each other, discussing the issues, and identifying common grounds, and looking for the way forward. That way forward that will lead us to sustainable, peaceful solutions. We want to regain the peace which we formerly enjoyed before this crisis. Thank you for your kind attention.
Esther, thank you very much for your personal and passionate account and the serious impact on women and children and the overall country. Father, I now invite you to share your experiences with the Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, and all protocol duly respected, for giving me this unique opportunity to address this august assembly. I am most honored and humbled, but delighted to share with you on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon. I am a priest and a pastor, and at the same time, the director of Caritas Bamenda. I would have preferred to be back home providing the badly needed humanitarian assistance to my affected, hungry, starving, stressed, and traumatized people. I am not a politician, but I'm here because of the lives of about 4 million people who are affected by this crisis. Within the context of the ongoing sociopolitical crisis, ever since it degenerated into an armed conflict in 2017 till date, things are only getting worse. The escalation began in the Anglophone regions in September 2017, when Cameroon security forces used live ammunition on peaceful protesters in protest marches. There have recently been disappearances, and even up to a few days ago, when I flew from Cameroon, corpses have been found in various places in Bamenda. Within the last 10 months, several thousands of civilians have been killed. The disappearance and death of young males is no longer news, and some of those who have been killed are persons with disability or special needs or the aged who cannot run away to safety. For want of time and sparing this noble house the embarrassment of the saddening situation we live in the Anglophone regions, I have left out the details of the recorded murders perpetrated either by the armed separatist groups, otherwise known as the Amba Boys, or the Cameroonian military, which acts as an instrument of terror to the local people. Corpses continue to be discovered here and there. It is hard to know the number of security forces or pro-independent fighters that might have been killed. What is certain is the fact that it's on an increase. Madam President, many buildings, including living homes, business centers, hospitals, private and public property, have been burned down in various localities in the English-speaking regions within the last 24 months. The belligerent parties have not claimed or accepted responsibility for these burnings. Yet, the figures are quite alarming. it is as indicated in these few statistics. In Bui Division alone, more than 1,500 houses have been razed down by flames, and the figures are on the increase. In Menchum Division, over 1,350 homes have been burnt down. In Momo Division, 2,000 plus homes and businesses razed to ashes. In Boyo, over 400 houses and at least 6 hospitals have been affected partly or completely by fires. The recent case being that of the district hospital of Kumba. These figures are not exhaustive, Madam President, and I am afraid they are on the rise. And it is logical, for the more homes are burned, the more people are displaced, the greater the humanitarian need. These needs are as of now underfunded. As of the 4 million people affected, below 10% receive humanitarian assistance from the international humanitarian organizations. Few international actors are on the field. IRC is in the southwest region providing paper vouchers for IDPs. CRS is in collaboration with Caritas Bamenda is in the northwest region providing e-vouchers for IDPs. Plan International and the Norwegian Missionary Society are worth mentioning here for their relentless effort. There are several others, for want of time I didn't mention. I do understand that access is a problem for the international NGOs, why they are dragging their feet, but the local partners do have a way to navigate to the targeted population, though not all the time. Madam President, as for access, the pro-independent fighters have made the region ungovernable. They have kept the roads impassable and grounded economic activities and the education sector, as well as the social life across the English regions, are also stagnant. There has been repeated reports of abductions by the same or other armed groups, and in some cases, reports of torture and demands for ransom. These abductions include 11 male students who were abducted on the 31st of Wednesday, the 31st of October, 2018. And a few days later, on the 4th of November, the same year, 2018, 78 students and 3 staff members of the same institution, the Presbyterian Secondary School, Nkwen, were equally abducted. The disquieting saga of St. Augustine's College, in which 176 members of the Catholic institution were abducted on the 16th of February 2018. Of this number, 170 students were generally below the age of 18. 3 of our priests who tried to follow the trail of the abductees were also caught and detained by the same group, and all were only released a day later. These incidents forced the institutions to close down, including a minor seminary and other schools in the locality. The enrollment in our Catholic schools for the last academic years has dropped to less than 20% as the crisis escalated. This indicates an estimate of the number of children who are likely out of school now, except those who have moved and are enrolled in other regions. In the nursery and primary schools, it stands at 55,000. In the secondary and high schools, it stands at 25,000 in these 2 English-speaking regions. Madam President, the health sector has been greatly affected. The St. Martin de Porres Catholic Mission Hospital in Ginicom, the Bingo Baptist Hospital in Boyo Division are greatly touched. Also, the St. Elizabeth General Hospital and Cardiac Center, the only cardiac center in West and Central of Africa, as well as the Banso Baptist Hospital, are not left out in this malaise. And a few others have been hit. Several people are said to have died at home who might have survived if they had access to health facilities. It is hard to imagine how many lives are being lost for the simple reason that patients are not able to move freely. The hospitals have had a tough time getting medications and or other hospital provisions. Patients that are referred to from these hospitals or to these hospitals often get stuck due to blockages and crossfires. Those from around the area who might manage to find motorbikes to transport them pay huge sums of money to get to the health facilities. They end up not having money to pay for their medication. Health workers have been victims of this crisis. 3 nurses have already been shot dead on their way to or from work, dressed in uniforms. Several have been attacked and wounded, even in the hospitals, where they render service to the nation. The military have got into health facilities with firearms, supposedly searching for anyone suspected to be a pro-independence fighter undergoing treatment. The World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders, Médecins du Monde, and others have been of invaluable help to the population in providing free health assistance. Madam President, a military solution has never been an option in any conflict resolution in the world. Dialogue is the solution. But who are those going to sit on the table? It's a question. I strongly appeal for the UN to get the protagonists to immediately stop the bloodshed and the killing of innocent civilians and call for a ceasefire. There is an urgent need of a neutral body to mediate and facilitate the dialogue in order to put an end to this humanitarian disaster. I appeal for the UN to equally scale up humanitarian assistance and force the Cameroonian government to demilitarize the Anglophone regions, because with a military presence, the future is bleak and the end to the crisis is far from being a reality. In addition to the activities of the government forces and the pro-independent fighters, there is a possibility that a few individuals might be using the situation to make money for themselves. This is the economy of war, which you are much aware of. Because of these, the killings, the looting, the burning, the rape, the random gun battles, shortage of food and other provisions, abductions, torture, growing hate, lack of trust, suspicion, and difficulty in burying the dead and even giving them a dignified burial, and many threats. Thousands of persons have been displaced within the 2 regions, and many others have fled to other places of the regions for safety. I received the very first set of displaced persons. There were 25 in number. They had been attacked, their homes burned, and a lady among them, her husband was shot point blank in front of her, and a military person used his own motorbike and poured gasoline on him and lit fire and had this man burned right in front of the wife. The wife was badly beaten with the machete, her hands wounded with the cutlass. She was beaten on the buttocks with a little baby of 2 years and another one that we're still holding, which was 5 years old. These came to my office. When they shared their experience, I wept at what was going on. Madam President, according to OCHA highlights on the site rep, 4 million people are affected in this. And in this number, 1.4 million are in need. 820,000 people are targeted. 530 are internally displaced persons. 376 are people in need of host communities. And of this number, 330,000 are people in great need. Therefore, as aforementioned, the UN and other international organizations should scale up the humanitarian activities in Cameroon to meet up with the high demands. Madam President, the people of the English-speaking regions in Cameroon are primarily agrarian, with houses burned and seeds lost. And adding to that, the farming season of 2018 was irregular due to the crisis. And so has been this season which just began. And only an estimate of 20% of the population have planted in that area, and which is an area which largely depends on agriculture. Food insecurity, therefore, malnutrition, and associated health challenges are imminent in the near future. I insist, Madam President, that the UN has to scale up its humanitarian operations in these regions, or more lives will be lost. Madam President, our people of these two English regions are suffering a lot. I bear witness to this. I meet them on a daily basis. We are in pain. We are traumatized. We are sandwiched between the Amber Boys and the government security forces. Fear is the order of the day. One cannot talk freely. I speak out the truth because it's a noble thing to do. It is doing a service to my country, even if it means I will be hated and killed. It is better to die with dignity for having told the truth than to live with shame for covering up. Many people live in a state of perpetual uncertainty and fear, not knowing what awaits them. Madam President, the UN can and should take actions to end this senseless bloodshed. There is an urgency to make a roadmap and engage both parties. Look at the root causes and drop the cosmetic solutions. Thank you for your kind attention, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Father, for your serious account as well and the impact, especially on schools and hospitals due to the humanitarian crisis. Jan, I hope you have been able to hear the conversation so far. And following your trip to Cameroon, what would you like the UN Security Council to know about what you saw? Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I want to thank the Security Council for this opportunity to speak about the massive humanitarian suffering I witnessed when I visited Cameroon 3 weeks ago. But let me start by commending and endorsing the strong statements from our two Cameroonian colleagues and from Mark Lowcock. So I traveled to the southwest province of Cameroon and to the far north. In the former, I met with the communities fleeing armed conflict. In the latter, I spoke with refugees and internally displaced families fleeing Boko Haram violence. Cameroon has, for many years, been a generous host itself to refugees, including from the Central African Republic and from Nigeria. We do appreciate the cooperation of authorities in providing sanctuary to people in great need. Madam President, when brutal fighting displaces hundreds of thousands of civilians, it usually sets international alarm bells ringing. But the shocking unmet needs of tens of thousands of people fleeing violence in southwest and northwest Cameroon has so far resulted in no systematic mediation effort, no large relief program, little international media interest, and too little pressure on the parties to stop attacking civilians. So the collective silence surrounding the atrocities is as shocking as the untold stories are heartbreaking, and we heard several here today. And that is why this session is so important, and I congratulate the conveners for having put it up. A group of displaced and disillusioned women I met told me that they felt abandoned by the international community, as much as they fear the conflicting parties. And they asked me, where is the international solidarity? Where are the African organizations? Where are the donor nations? Where is Europe? This conflict has, after all, some of its roots in generations of interference from European colonial powers. I also met with families from hundreds of villages that have been burnt. They affirmed that tens of thousands of people are still hiding in the bushes, and that new attacks are taking place every single week. Children have been denied the right to education for years because of the political conflicts between grown adults. Most schools have been closed for years, and the Ministry of Education affirms that at least 780,000 children are out of school. So we risk losing a generation to illiteracy. I was also, like my colleagues who spoke, shocked by the scale and brutality of the blunt violence against civilians. Even hospitals have been attacked and health workers fear for their lives. The absence of a humanitarian response commensurate to the hundreds of thousands of people in great need and with unmet needs is striking. We are too few humanitarian actors on the ground, and we are gravely underfunded. My colleagues in the Norwegian Refugee Council and the other relief organizations on the ground tell me they can reach many more people in need in the conflict-ravaged areas in the southwest and northwest, despite the insecurity. And the parties to the conflict now also tell us they are ready to support access to all areas of great need. This includes the Southwest governor, whom I spoke to in Where, and it includes the armed opposition groups with whom we are in contact. And now our immediate priority must be access and assistance to the people hiding in the bushes who are, as of today, receiving no assistance nor protection. They fear they cannot return to their villages, nor do they feel that it is safe for them to go to the urban centers. These families are terrorized beyond belief. Similarly, in the far north of Cameroon, civilians feel abandoned. The humanitarian response there is also severely underfunded and now also underreported. The displaced children I met in the capital town, Marua, and surrounding areas had hoped one day to return to their ancestral land from where they fled Boko Haram violence. But they cannot return. The insecurity still plagues these areas. So the only thing that has changed for these communities is that their suffering and the violence waged against them has disappeared from our TV screens, from our hearts, and from our minds. In my 40 years as a humanitarian worker, I have too often seen how the lack of early intervention results in smaller conflicts becoming horrific and endless wars. There is still time to avoid the conflict in the southwest and northwest from escalating even further, with untold suffering as a consequence. Equally, there is time to give hope and durable solutions to displaced families in the far north and to the Central African refugees or the Nigerian refugees that Cameroon hosts. Okay, so, Madam President, UN Security Council members, our conclusion, seen from the realities on the ground where I consulted with my colleagues, are the following. First, the UN, the Secretariat, the Security Council, and all of the agencies and programs of this great family of organizations need to do better in what we have all pledged, namely to act to ensure conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and bridge building in communities before it is too late. The crisis in the English-speaking part of Cameroon is, without any doubt, one of the world's most neglected at the moment. The lack of information and international political tension has not prevented the situation to deteriorate from peaceful demonstrations to the current atrocities committed by both sides. We need more independent information and reporting on the crisis. More than anything, we need more action to protect and assist defenseless civilians. So we urgently need national and international conflict resolution resources to help stop the violence and start talks about the many grievances that do exist. Mediation or facilitation of peace talks should be done by local, national, and international actors who have the trust of both the government and the non-state armed groups. Second, organizations and countries with influence in the conflicting parties must make it clear that the attacks on civilians, on their homes, on schools, on hospitals, on villages, are crimes under international law that cannot be allowed to continue. This deep and acute protection crisis should be alleviated by a greater presence by international organizations. And the UN humanitarian country team should be given the financial and human resources to put protection at the center of its response. My third point, I think a first step to break the vicious cycle could be a concerted international effort to reopen and provide protection for schools and school children. Today, the political and strategic conflict among grown politicians and armed men has paralyzed education for young people. It must be possible to depoliticize education. Grown adults must at least agree on finding a way for children to return to school as their mothers are met before. To do this, both parties must show willingness to make compromise on the issues that so early became contentious in this conflict. UN and humanitarian partners also need to strengthen our efforts to pave the way for an effective education response. Fourth, we need to ramp up the humanitarian response. As the emergency relief coordinator well noted, many of the more than 1 million people who need humanitarian support now have received no assistance. A massive funding injection is needed to save lives. We need to extend the scope of the humanitarian response beyond city centers and into rural areas in southwest and northwest regions. And the total funding for Cameroon must be ramped up. Money cannot just be shifted from other regions in Cameroon towards the crisis in the southwest and the northwest. So as my colleagues just said, we must act now. More lives and more hope will be lost, and the future of a generation of Cameroonians do hang in the balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, for your firsthand insights of the challenges on the ground and what the UN system and international community can do.